My name is Antonio Fortunato and I work at the European Astronaut Center as Deputy Team Lead for Crew Operations. Once the crew gets to the space station, what do they do? Well, obviously the main reason why the ISS is in space is science, research. A lot of time is spent by the astronauts on the ISS performing science, especially human life science experiments, but also experiments in other fields like material science or biology, or simple technological demonstrations, or demonstrations of the efficiency of certain operational strategies. One of the objectives and one of the uses of the space station program is to actually serve as a testbed for future exploration missions. Now in this picture you can see, for instance, Italian astronaut Paolo Nespoli while he's working in the US lab with the microgravity science glove box. This is actually quite an interesting example because the MSG is another example of hardware that was built in Europe, and it is currently operated very successfully by NASA to perform all types of science. If we look at what is specifically done in the Columbus module, well, as I mentioned before, Columbus is by and large a module where human life science experiments are done. What you see here is a Japanese astronaut, Aki Yoshide, performing an oxygen uptake measurement during the energy experiment. Of course, science is not the only activity that's performed on station. A big amount of time is also spent on system maintenance. Now, you remember the first module of the ISS, Zarya, was launched on November 20, 1998. So it is by now in space since almost 16 years. And in those 16 years, systems have aged, systems have failed, and the astronauts had to perform certain repairs. In this picture, you actually see Dutch astronaut Andre Kuipers performing an inspection of the cabin fan assemblies in Columbus. Basically, the ventilation fans responsible for having the air moving inside the cabin of the Columbus module. At some point, we realized that the performance of those fans was degraded, and we suspected that the reason might have been the accumulation of dust inside the ventilation ducts leading to the cabin fans. We built up an activity, and Andre actually took care of performing the inspection. It was quite an interesting activity because, first of all, it required tilting one of the deck racks in Columbus, this white box that you see on the left, and that deck rack actually contains a lot of critical systems for the Columbus module. So that was already quite interesting by itself. Also, what was interesting is that the inspection of the ventilation ducts couldn't be done directly. Andre had to use a fiber scope to really put the camera inside the ducts and to see what was the problem there. Also, what was interesting about this activity is that sometimes you never know what to expect from space activities. First of all, we found dust. Yes, we found the reason why the performance of the cabin fans was compromised, but the dust was not where we expected. It was on a completely different place, and just by chance, Andre realized actually where the problem was. Also, what was interesting, that what was supposed to be the simple activity, so just closing back that deck rack, turned out to be more complicated than expected, and because of some small calibration issues, it took actually quite a long time to simply close back that deck one rack. And you see here just another example. This is not technically system maintenance, it's more like system operations. This is astronaut Luca Parmitano installing a hydrocyclone on one of the Columbus water pumps, and this hydrocyclone is actually used to remove gas bubbles that might have formed inside the cooling loops internal of the Columbus module. Now, other activities that are performed in space are robotics. This is what we mentioned before. Robotics is a big part of an astronaut's everyday life on the ISS. We have vehicle dockings, and vehicle dockings actually happen quite often recently, and most of those vehicle dockings are performed by robotics. And you see here, for instance, this is a picture from 2009. Those are NASA astronaut Nicole Stott and ESA astronaut Frank Devin. In the US lab at that point, the cupola had not been installed yet, performing robotic operations in support of the capture and berthing of the first HTV. HTV is the Japanese cargo vehicle, and it is normally berthed to the nadir-facing port of Node 2. You can see here a picture of a captured HTV on its way to be berthed to the ISS. Also, one activity that is occurring more and more often are extravehicular activities. Of course, there were a lot of EVAs just to build and maintain the ISS. We had about 175 EVAs since the beginning of the program. Now, the thing is, systems fail, and systems that are outside fail as well. And when this happens, usually the astronauts have to go outside and perform repairs. And sometimes the repairs must be done relatively quickly because the system that has failed might have a specific impact on the overall station operations. One very good example is the failure of one of the pump modules that are outside the ISS. This failure happened in summer of 2010, and it was a pretty bad thing because without that pump, we weren't able to circulate the ammonia, so we weren't able to cool down the half of the loads on the US side of the space station. And if you cannot cool down something, obviously you cannot power it up, because if it power it up and it doesn't dissipate heat, then it burns. Of course, this wasn't a very favorable situation, and an EVA had to be organized in a very short time frame, and NASA astronauts Doug Willock and Tracy Caldwell-Dyson performed actually those 3 EVAs where the pump module, the failed pump module, was extracted, set apart, and the new pump module was put in place. Very successful operation. There were again a number of hiccups in usually the areas where you don't expect them. There was one QD that quick disconnect that didn't exactly work properly, and also there were some bolts retaining the pump module in place that were a little bit more stubborn than we hoped they would be. So EVA is an important part of an astronaut's life on board the ISS. You see in this picture is astronaut Alexander Gerst in the EVA that he has performed just a few days ago, and here is standing in front of latching and effector, so the very tip of the Canadarm. This is another nice picture of an astronaut preparing to perform a repair on one of the station solar panels. And you see also here the important synergies between extravehicular activities and robotics. For an activity like this, it would be extremely difficult for the astronaut to translate to that point and attach safely and perform its repairs. While with the robotic arm, it's relatively simple to just extend the arm up to a point where the astronaut can work directly on the solar panel. Last but not least, an important activity that's done by the astronauts on board the ISS is outreach and public relations. The ISS program is a big program. It's a program that involves many nations. And it is a program that is also often given for granted. People not always remember how amazing and what is the meaning of having such an incredible spacecraft orbiting Earth. Sometimes the impact of the science that's performed on board the ISS is not as visible because, for instance, it relates to questions that are in fundamental science, and those questions do not necessarily translate into visible products, into visible outcomes in a very short time. So it is very important that the astronauts actually engage in those outreach activities, connect, for instance, with their communities of origin, and explain the beauty and the usefulness of human spaceflight to people. This is a picture that I like very much because it actually shows one point in time during Expedition 21 where on board the ISS there were actually astronauts representing each and every partner nation in the ISS program. We have Gennady Padalka and Roman Romanenko from Russia, Frank Devine from Belgium and ESA, Bob Thirsk from Canada, Koichi Wakata from Japan. He would later become, by the way, the first Japanese commander for the ISS, as Frank Devine was at that point the first European commander of the ISS. And then we have NASA astronauts Tim Kopra and Mike Barrett. Now, 6 months might look like a long time, but it actually feels very short. It definitely feels short even for the people supporting the astronauts on the ground. And after a 6-month mission, sooner or later, the time comes for re-entry. So re-entry to Earth is, I'm told, quite an amazing experience. Imagine you have been 6 months in space, 6 months in weightlessness. Obviously, you have exercised, you have gotten yourself ready to come back to Earth, but the fact is you were weightless for 6 months, and then out of a sudden you are brought back to Earth, and the re-entry involves, in a nominal case, loads in the order of 3 to 4 times normal gravity. And then, if that were not enough, when you're just 1 meter above the ground, you have the soft landing rockets firing. Now, the soft landing rockets do not really provide a soft landing. As some of the astronauts say, they just turn a deadly crash into a survivable crash, but a crash nonetheless. And if that were not enough, sometimes, depending on the conditions of the wind and of the terrain, the capsule might not land straight on the ground, but might land on the side, which actually means that after 6 months, again, that you are in 0G, you're exposed to 3 to 4 times your weight. Then you're exposed to the equivalent of a car crash, and then you might be hanging for a number of minutes against your strap, face down, till the search and rescue forces actually manage to reach the Soyuz capsule and open it up. Once they have taken you out of the capsule, usually the astronauts are given some time to breathe and enjoy their landing back on Earth. I especially like this picture because it's related to a very special landing. You see that in the middle, the Soyuz commander Fyodor Yurchikhin is holding the Olympic torch of the Sochi Winter Olympics of 2013. Now, that Olympic torch had been brought up by another Soyuz crew just a few days before, and it had been brought outside the space station in an extravehicular activity, and the crew of Fyodor, ESA astronaut Luca Parmitano, and NASA astronaut Karen Nyberg actually brought it back to Earth. And that, incidentally, was the first time an Olympic torch was ever brought to space and back. Landing, re-entry, there is a 6-month post-flight after that. In this post-flight, basically, the astronauts try to recuperate from their time in space. They readapt to living in normal conditions. And of course, they undergo a number of baseline data collections for science. They participate in the briefings where they explain to their colleague what their experience has been in space, what kind of changes can be done in the future, and so on and so forth. In very short, this is the journey, the typical journey of an astronaut on board the ISS through training, onboard operations, and post-flight. Hope you enjoyed.